All this debate will leave you wondering, is military action against Syria really a good idea? We're talking about this with Dr. Alan Kuperman, a UT Associate Professor of Public Affairs and a U.S. military intervention expert. First and foremost, thank you for being with us tonight. We appreciate it. I have to ask you, what is your opinion on U.S. involvement? That's first.
Well, there's first this question of what to do about the chemical weapons attack, and that allegedly the Assad government did in Syria that killed hundreds, maybe over 1,000 civilians. And the way I term it is we need a Goldilocks approach, right? The Goldilocks approach is not too hot, not too cold. We don't want to do too little in terms of responding because that might embolden Assad to use chemical weapons again. On the other hand, we don't want to do too much because if we overthrow him, let's say, right now the rebels are infiltrated with al-Qaeda elements. And what that means is if we overthrow him now, al-Qaeda will either come into power or could acquire chemical weapons or could get a safe haven. It'll be like Afghanistan before 9/11. So not too hot, not too cold, just right. That's in the short term. But in the longer term, we need some sort of strategy to end this civil war once and for all so that we make sure that we get control of those chemical weapons and ideally dispose of the chemical weapons.
So what would come next? Say there is U.S. involvement. It sounds like you're saying a two-day barrage of cruise missiles that they're talking about won't really tip the balance, so to speak, of the Syrian civil war against the Assad regime. So if that's true, then what? What happens after we go in?
Well, it won't tip the balance, and because it's designed not to tip the balance. As I said, if we overthrow Assad right now, we might bring al-Qaeda into power or get them chemical weapons. So that's the short-term strategy, is to punish Assad in order to deter him from using chemical weapons and to degrade his military to inhibit their ability to use chemical weapons in the short term. But in the long term, what we need to do is we need to bolster the moderate, secular, multi-ethnic elements of the Syrian rebels, and that is a long-term proposition. That is not something that's going to happen quickly. When you said in your report that no weapons have gone to the Syrian rebels yet from the United States, that's because we think if we send them now, they're going to wind up in al-Qaeda's hands. So it's going to be a long, I would say, a multi-year process to try and build up this moderate opposition. Once they're built up, then either they might take power or you might get into some negotiation where there would be a power-sharing agreement. Assad would leave, but some elements of his military, some elements of his government, and the Alawite ethnic or sectarian minority in Syria would be able to survive, and the Christians would be able to survive in Syria. It's a long-term process.
Okay, just quickly, we have about 30 seconds left. I have to ask you, when you're talking long-term, what about the cost involved? We're promised no boots on the ground, so to speak, but critics will say this war could exhaust our leadership. What cost would we be looking at?
I think the greatest cost would be if Congress said no. That would undercut the credibility of the United States. The president drew a red line, and then Congress would say, sorry, you can't enforce the red line. That means the president has no credibility. That means the U.S. has no credibility. That means Iran looks at this and says, okay, we can get nuclear weapons because U.S. threats are empty. I think that's the greatest threat. Going forward, the cost of the military involvement will depend on how Syria reacts. If they take the blow and just say, okay, we get it, we won't use chemical weapons, the cost will be relatively small. If they retaliate, for example, launch missiles into Israel, Israel retaliates, Iran gets involved, it could be very expensive, but I don't think we'll see boots on the ground, not American boots on the ground.
Dr. Alan Kuperman for us tonight. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.